Get him off this plane now. Denise Colton did not shout it. She said it the way people say things they have already decided are true. The way a judge reads a verdict that was written before the trial began. The words moved through the cabin of Meridian Skyways Flight 2140 like cold air let in through a cracked window, and every conversation in first class stopped at once. Julian Marsh did not move. He sat in seat 2A with a plain black laptop bag at his feet, a gray hoodie zipped halfway up, and a boarding pass resting face up on the tray table in front of him. Seat 2A. Confirmed, paid in full 6 weeks earlier. He looked, if anyone had bothered to really look, like a man who had rolled out of bed and grabbed the first clean shirt he found. Nobody in that cabin had any reason to know that the plain black bag at his feet held a laptop worth less than the fountain pen in his jacket pocket, and that the fountain pen had signed contracts worth more than the airplane they were all sitting in. Denise stood over him, with one hand braced on the headrest of the seat in front of his, the other holding a small service tablet against her hip, like a shield. Her Meridian Skyways uniform was pressed to a shine, navy blue with gold piping, and her smile had the particular thinness of a smile that is being worn as a weapon. Behind her, near the galley curtain, a heavy-set white man in a charcoal suit stood tapping 2 fingers against the strap of his briefcase. Gerald Whitmore, 64 years old, a gold watch that cost more than most people's cars. The kind of face that had never once had to wait for anything in its life, and had begun to take personal offense at the idea that today might be different. Julian looked up slowly. "Is there a problem with my seat?" he said. His voice was even, not loud, not soft either, just level. The way a man speaks when he has learned that raising his voice has never once gotten him anything except blamed. "There's been a seating adjustment," Denise said. A woman 2 rows back lowered her magazine an inch. A man across the aisle paused with his coffee halfway to his mouth. Somebody, 3 rows behind Julian, whispered to their seatmate, "What's going on up there?" Julian reached down, picked his boarding pass up off the tray table, and held it up between 2 fingers, close enough that Denise could read it without leaning. "My seat is 2A, he said. "It says so right here." Denise glanced at it. Not long enough to read it. Long enough to look like she had. "I understand what it says, sir." The word sir should have carried respect. It did not. It came out of her mouth, the way a stapler comes down on paper, flat and final, a word used to close something rather than open it. Julian felt the old pressure settle into his chest. Not fear, not surprise. Recognition. He had felt this exact pressure in hotel lobbies where the manager was suddenly needed at the desk the second he walked in. He had felt it in boardrooms where 3 different men had shaken the hand of the white associate standing behind him before anyone thought to ask who actually ran the meeting. He had felt it every single time someone decided what he was worth before they had bothered to find out what he had built. But none of that reached his face. He set the boarding pass back down, squared it against the edge of the tray table, and folded his hands. "I need this seat," he said. "I have work to do before we land." Behind Denise, Whitmore stepped forward, close enough now that his cologne reached row 2. "Denise," he said, not troubling himself to lower his voice, the way men do when they have never once considered that a lowered voice might be a form of respect owed to a stranger. "I have a closing in Chicago at 11. I always sit in this row, every single time." Julian turned his head, unhurried, and looked at him. Whitmore's eyes swept over him. The way a man's eyes sweep over a folding chair, he is deciding whether to bother moving. Not as a person, as an obstacle wearing a hoodie. Denise gave Whitmore a small, apologetic nod, the nod of a woman reassuring a regular customer that the inconvenience in row 2 would shortly be dealt with. "We're handling it, Mr. Whitmore." That sentence told Julian everything he needed to know. This was not a mistake. A mistake apologizes. A mistake checks the manifest twice. This was a decision, made quietly somewhere behind a galley curtain, dressed up afterward in the soft gray language that airlines use when they want cruelty to sound like procedure. Somewhere on this aircraft, someone had looked at a seating chart, looked at the two names attached to seat 2A's row, and decided which one of them looked like he belonged there. Julian's phone buzzed once against his knee. He did not look down yet. Discipline, not hesitation. Men who had built anything worth having did not learn to survive by reacting to the first spark. They learned to survive by watching the whole room before they moved a single finger. Denise leaned in closer. Close enough, now that her voice carried past row 2 and into row 3. "Sir, I'm going to need your cooperation." Somewhere behind him, a phone rose into the air. A tiny mechanical click. Then another. People were filming. Denise heard it too. She kept going anyway, and that, more than anything she had said so far, was the detail that would matter later. Because a woman who stops when she notices she is being recorded still has room left to be embarrassed. A woman who keeps going has already decided the recording will not change the outcome. "We can rebook you in economy," Denise said, "and issue a travel voucher for the inconvenience." Julian looked at her. Then at Whitmore, whose shoulders had already begun to relax, the posture of a man watching a formality complete itself. Then, down at the boarding pass in his hand. His father's voice rose up in his memory before he had asked it to. Thomas Marsh, standing at the stove in a rented duplex on Statesville Avenue in Charlotte, North Carolina, spatula in one hand, the smell of bacon grease thick in the small kitchen, saying the same thing he said every single time young Julian came home from school, with his shirt untucked and his jaw tight. Don't you ever let a man make you feel small just because he needs to feel tall. Julian breathed in through his nose, slow, and let it back out. He had built Ironwood Capital Partners out of a windowless sublet office on North Tryon Street, with 2 employees, and a line of credit that 3 different banks had laughed him out of, before the 4th one finally said yes. He had sat across conference tables from men who smiled at him with perfect teeth while explaining, in the gentlest possible language, why his numbers just weren't quite where they needed to be. Numbers that were better than the numbers of the man sitting next to him, whose loan had cleared in 9 days. He had watched weaker deals get waved through rooms he had to knock on twice just to be heard the first time. And now here he was. Seat 2A, paid for, confirmed. Still being asked, politely, cheerfully, in the gentlest customer service voice Meridian Skyways could manufacture, to prove all over again that he belonged in the seat he was already sitting in. "I'm not moving," Julian said. The cabin went still in a way that had weight to it. Somebody's ice cubes clinked once and then went quiet. Denise's smile did not vanish so much as it lost its structure. The way a held expression collapses once the muscles behind it stop trying. Whitmore scoffed loudly enough for the whole cabin to hear. "Oh, for God's sake." Julian's voice stayed low, but every word came out clean, unhurried, and impossible to talk over. "This is my seat. I paid for it. I have a confirmed boarding pass in my hand. If you want me removed from this aircraft, I need you to say, out loud, in front of these people, exactly why." For 1 second, something flickered across Denise's face that had not been there before. Uncertainty. She glanced past Julian's shoulder, toward the front of the cabin, toward a man Julian had not noticed until just now, standing half-hidden behind the galley curtain in a charcoal executive suit. Silver hair combed back hard enough to look armored, a jaw set like it had been carved rather than grown. Preston Vance, Meridian Skyways Vice President of Operations, watching the entire exchange the way a man watches a stock ticker he already knows the ending of. Vance gave Denise the smallest possible nod, barely a movement. But Julian saw it, and it told him everything. This was not about one seat. This was not even about Whitmore's wounded pride. This was a company protecting itself, one small cruelty at a time, and Denise Colton was simply the hand it had chosen to do it with. Then I'll need to call for assistance, Denise said, straightening. Julian's thumb moved across the screen of his phone. Not fast. Not for show. Once. A single confirmation tap that most of the people in that cabin would never understand the meaning of until much later, when it was already too late for Meridian Skyways to undo what had just happened. He set the phone face down on the tray table. "Do what you think you need to do," he said quietly. And in the silence that followed, Julian Marsh sat perfectly still, hands folded, while an airline began making the most expensive mistake in its 41-year history. Here is the part you need to remember because it is going to matter more with every minute that passes. At 6:52 that morning, a wire transfer of $30 million had cleared into Meridian Skyways' corporate account from a firm called Ironwood Capital Partners. It was the first installment of a $150 million rescue financing deal that had taken 11 months to negotiate, a deal that was the only thing standing between Meridian Skyways and a bankruptcy filing that would have grounded 11,000 employees inside of 90 days. Nobody in first class knew that. Denise Colton did not know it. Gerald Whitmore certainly did not know it. And the quiet man in the hoodie in seat 2A had absolutely no intention of telling them. Denise Colton turned on her heel and walked toward the galley, her low heels striking the cabin floor in quick, hard beats that sounded, in the silence of first class, almost like a countdown. Julian watched her go without turning his head to follow the passengers who were still recording. He did not look at Whitmore, who had already begun rolling his shoulders back, settling into the posture of a man who considers victory a formality rather than something that has to be earned. Julian kept his eyes on the curtain at the front of the cabin, where Preston Vance stood with his jaw locked tight, and, for the first time that morning, the faint shine of sweat along his hairline. Vance had spent 31 years inside Meridian Skyways. He knew every union grievance procedure by memory. He knew which board members owed him favors from decisions made a decade ago that nobody talked about anymore. He had survived 2 bankruptcy scares, a fuel crisis, and 3 changes of CEO by learning exactly one skill better than anyone else in the building. How to make the exercise of power look, on paper, like the simple following of a rule. And right now, for reasons he could not yet name, that skill was failing him. Because the man in seat 2A did not behave like someone who could be frightened into silence. Vance stepped forward into the aisle. "Sir," he said, his voice carrying the practiced calm of a man used to being obeyed the moment he opens his mouth. "I'm Preston Vance, Vice President of Operations for Meridian Skyways. I understand there's been some confusion about your seat assignment." "There's no confusion," Julian said. "I know exactly what's happening." Vance's eyes narrowed a fraction. He had expected anger, or fear, or the particular kind of pleading that people do when they are trying to talk their way out of a decision that has already been made above their heads. He had not expected stillness. Stillness, in Vance's experience, belonged to people who already knew something he didn't. "We simply need you to relocate to economy for this flight," Vance said. "We'll comp you a first-class fare credit for a future trip, and no," Julian said, one word, flat. Final. It landed in the cabin the way a dropped glass lands on tile, and for a second, nobody moved, because everyone in first class understood, without being told, that they were no longer watching a customer service disagreement. They were watching 2 men decide who was going to blink first, and the man in the hoodie had no intention of blinking at all. Vance leaned down slightly, lowering his voice, though it did nothing to keep the exchange private. "Sir, I don't think you understand the position you're putting yourself in. If you refuse a lawful crew instruction, we are within our rights to have you removed from this aircraft." Julian looked up at him, unhurried. "Then remove me," he said. "But I want it understood right now, in front of every passenger holding up a phone, that Meridian Skyways is removing a paying, seated, confirmed first-class passenger from his assigned seat to accommodate a man who simply prefers it. A murmur moved through the cabin. Across the aisle, a man in his 50s named Colin Hastings lowered his tablet and watched with the particular stillness of a person calculating the odds of getting involved. Colin ran a logistics consulting firm that did nearly $4 million a year in business with 3 different airlines, Meridian among them, and every instinct in his body told him to say something, to stand up, to point out what was obviously happening in front of him. Every instinct also told him that Meridian's contracts group had his firm's name on file, and that the easiest way to keep a contract was to keep his mouth shut and let someone else's problem stay, someone else's problem. He looked down at his tablet again. He did not say a word. It was a decision he would replay in his head for months afterward at 2 in the morning, unable to fully explain to himself why staying quiet had felt, in that exact moment, like the responsible thing to do. Near the back of the first-class cabin, a much younger flight attendant named Grace Sullivan stood frozen with a coffee pot still in her hand. She was 26 years old, 4 months into the job, and she had watched the entire exchange unfold with a growing, sick tightness behind her ribs. She had no authority here. She was not senior crew. She had no say in seating decisions, and she had been told on her 2nd day of training, in almost exactly these words, that questioning a senior flight attendant in front of passengers was the fastest way to end a probationary contract. But she remembered, with a clarity that surprised her, the exact moment Julian had held up his boarding pass, calm, steady, entirely reasonable, and she remembered thinking, with something close to shame, that if this had been her sitting in 2A, nobody would have dared say a word. Vance straightened up. "Very well," he said, and the coldness in his voice had fully returned, now all trace of customer service warmth gone. "Denise, call the gate. We'll have security meet us when we return to the jet bridge." "We haven't left the gate," Julian said quietly. "I'm aware," Vance said. "That makes this considerably easier." Here is where the story stops being about one seat and starts being about a much longer, much older pattern, one that had been quietly running underneath Meridian Skyways' polished customer service scripts for years. Because what Preston Vance did next was not an improvisation. It was a decision he had made 100 times before in 100 smaller ways, a decision built on the confidence that the passenger in seat 2A, whoever he turned out to be, would fold the way every other passenger before him had folded. Vance had no way of knowing that this particular passenger had spent the last 11 months building the very deal that was, at that moment, the only thing keeping Meridian Skyways' name off a bankruptcy court's docket. And Julian Marsh had no intention of telling him. Not yet. He wanted to see exactly how far this would go first. 2 airport security officers boarded the aircraft 11 minutes later. Julian stood when they reached his row, unhooking his own seatbelt before anyone had to ask him to, because he had already decided he was not going to give Preston Vance the satisfaction of a struggle to point a camera at. He picked up his laptop bag himself. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue with the officers, who looked, if anything, faintly uncomfortable with the assignment they had been handed, because removing a calm, well-dressed, cooperative passenger from an airplane for the crime of refusing to give up a seat he had paid for was not the kind of call either of them had signed up to make. As he stepped past row 3, an older black woman reached out and gently touched his sleeve. She said nothing. She simply looked at him, and in that look was 40 years of every version of this moment she had lived through herself. Every time she had been asked to prove she belonged somewhere she had already paid to be. Julian nodded to her once and kept walking. Whitmore did not look at him as he passed. He was already settling into seat 2A, adjusting the seat back entirely unbothered, a man who had gotten exactly what he expected the world to give him and felt no particular need to examine how he had gotten it. At the top of the jet bridge, in the cold fluorescent light of the terminal, Julian Marsh stopped walking. He set his bag down. He took out his phone, and this time, he did not hesitate. He opened a single encrypted message thread labeled Ironwood, Meridian Deal Team, and he typed 6 words that would detonate through Meridian Skyways executive floor within the hour. Freeze all remaining tranches, effective immediately. He hit send. Then he looked up at the 2 security officers standing beside him, at Preston Vance, walking briskly toward him down the jet bridge, with the particular urgency of a man who has just realized, somewhere in the pit of his stomach, that he may have made a catastrophic error. And Julian said the only thing he had left to say. "You're going to want to find out who I am before you finish writing your incident report." Vance stopped walking. Something in the younger man's stillness, the way he had said it without a trace of threat, without raising his voice, even slightly, made the hair on the back of Vance's neck rise in a way 31 years of airline crisis management had not prepared him for. "And who exactly are you?" Vance said, though the confidence had already started leaking out of the sentence before he finished saying it. Julian Marsh looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket, passed the fountain pen, and took out a business card. Plain white, no logo, just a name, a title, and a phone number. Julian Marsh, founder and managing partner, Ironwood Capital Partners. He held it out. Vance took it. And as he read it, his face did something Julian had seen happen to exactly this kind of man before many times, in many boardrooms. It was not shock exactly. It was the particular specific horror of a man realizing that the floor he has been standing on his entire career was never as solid as he believed. "You're going to want to sit down for this next part," Julian said quietly, "because it gets worse before it gets better." Preston Vance's phone began ringing in his hand less than 90 seconds later. It was Meridian Skyways' chief financial officer, a woman named Sandra Ochoa, and her voice, when Vance answered, had a pitch to it that he had not heard from her in the 11 years they had worked together. "Preston," she said, "tell me you have not done what I think you just did." "I don't know what you're referring to," Vance said, though he already did. Ironwood Capital just froze the second tranche of the rescue financing. $120 million, Preston. Gone, frozen, effective immediately. Their general counsel is already on the phone with ours. A pause, and when she spoke again, her voice had dropped to something close to disbelief. "The freeze notice cites, and I am reading this to you directly off the email, quote, an incident involving the unlawful removal of the firm's founder and managing partner from a confirmed first-class seat on Flight 2140 this morning," end quote. Another pause. "Preston, what did you do?" Vance looked down the jet bridge to where Julian Marsh stood, waiting, calm, unhurried, watching him with an expression that was not triumph. It was something closer to patience. The particular patience of a man who has been waiting his entire adult life for someone in Vance's position to finally understand what it feels like to be the one asking permission. "I need you to get me the board chairman," Vance said into the phone, his voice suddenly very small, "right now." By 11 that morning, the video was everywhere. Somebody in row 4 of first class, a woman traveling to a wedding in Chicago, who had never intended to become part of a corporate crisis, had posted a 40-second clip to her account with the caption, "They just kicked a man off a plane for refusing to give up the seat he paid for," and it already had 200,000 views before Meridian Skyways communications team had even finished their first internal call. By early afternoon, it had climbed past 2 million, and the comment section had done what comment sections do, filling with a mixture of outrage, disbelief, and the particular weary recognition of thousands of people typing versions of the same 4 words. "This happened to me too." Inside Meridian Skyways' downtown Charlotte headquarters, a hastily assembled group had gathered in the 14th floor conference rooms by 2 o'clock. Harold Weiss, the company's CEO, stood at the head of the table with his tie loosened and his face the color of old paper. General Counsel Diane Ashcroft sat to his right, with 3 folders open in front of her, each one thicker than the last. A junior attorney hovered near the door, afraid to sit down. And Preston Vance sat at the far end of the table, still in the same charcoal suit he had been wearing on the jet bridge that morning, saying, for the 4th time in 20 minutes, that he had simply been following the seating protocol. There is no seating protocol that instructs staff to remove a confirmed passenger to accommodate someone who simply prefers a specific seat, Diane Ashcroft said, without looking up from the folder in front of her. I've read the operations manual twice this afternoon, Preston. It does not exist. Gerald Whitmore has flown with us for 11 years, Vance said. He is He is a passenger who does not own the airplane, Diane said. The man you had removed does. The room went silent in a way that had physical weight to it. Nobody moved. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning, and, somewhere down the hall, a phone that had not stopped ringing in over 3 hours. I want that clarified for the record, Harold Weiss said slowly, because I think some of us are still catching up. Julian Marsh does not own this airline. No, Diane said, but as of 6:52 this morning, Ironwood Capital Partners became this airline's single largest creditor, with $150 million committed to keep us out of Chapter 11 by the end of the fiscal year. $30 million of that already cleared, and at 9:04 this morning, they froze the remaining $120 million, citing this morning's incident by name. She finally looked up directly at Vance. So no, Preston. He does not own the airline. He owns whether we have one. The door opened. Julian Marsh walked in without waiting to be announced, followed by a woman in her 30s carrying a slim leather folder, his general counsel, Monica Reyes. He did not sit at the head of the table. He took a chair halfway down, where he could see everyone's face at once, and set his own folder down without opening it. Mr. Marsh, Harold Weiss said, standing, I want to say on behalf of this entire company how deeply, deeply sorry. Save it, Julian said, not unkindly, but without patience either. I'm not here for an apology performance. I'm here to understand what this company actually is, before I decide whether Ironwood keeps $120 million tied up in it. Weiss sat back down slowly. Julian looked at Vance for the first time since walking in. Mr. Vance, he said, explain to me in your own words why you decided I needed to be removed from a seat I paid for. Vance's jaw tightened. For a long moment he said nothing, and in that silence, everyone in the room could see him deciding, in real time, whether to finally tell the truth or keep defending a decision that had already cost the company $150 million in confidence alone. There was a seating conflict, Vance said finally. I made a judgment call to resolve it quickly, in the interest of minimizing disruption to the flight. A judgment call, Julian repeated. Based on what? Based on the information available to me at the time. What information? Julian said. I had a confirmed boarding pass. Mr. Whitmore did not. There was no conflict. There was a preference, and you decided whose preference mattered more the second you looked at both our faces. Vance's mouth opened, then closed. Diane Ashcroft watched him with the flat, professional stillness of a lawyer who has just watched a witness fail to answer a question she already knew he couldn't answer. I don't accept that characterization, Vance said. You don't have to, Julian said. I have 40 seconds of video from 6 different angles that already have. So does every regulator who's going to be reviewing this by Monday morning. Diane Ashcroft slid one of her folders across the table toward Weiss. While we're on the subject, she said, I pulled the last 5 years of premium cabin complaint records this afternoon. Preston's name appears, directly or indirectly, in the resolution notes of 11 separate incidents involving passengers of color being reassigned, downgraded, or removed. to accommodate other passengers' preferences. All 11 were closed as, and I'm quoting the internal language here, quote, service adjustments, end quote. None were escalated. None were investigated. The room had gone very still. Weiss picked up the folder and read the first page without speaking. A director from the Atlanta office, joining by video from a laptop propped at the end of the table, took off his glasses and set them down slowly, the way people do when they need a second to absorb something before they can look at it directly again. 11, Weiss said quietly. That we found in 5 years, Diane said. I would not be surprised if the real number is higher. Preston Vance's face had gone a shade of gray that had nothing to do with his silver hair. Those were individual service decisions made by individual crew members, he said. I don't see how. You approved every one of them, Diane said. It's your signature on the resolution sign-offs. All 11. Julian watched him. Not with anger. Something quieter, and in its own way heavier, an exhaustion that had been building for 20 years and had finally found the one room in the world where somebody with enough power to matter was being forced to hear it. You still haven't said the word. Sorry, he said. Not once in this entire conversation. Do you understand why that matters more than anything else you've said today? Vance looked at him, and for the first time, something like real fear moved behind his eyes, though it was still tangled up with pride, still unwilling to fully surrender. I did what I believed was correct at the time, he said. I still believe I was following the standards this company set for me. Then this company's standards are the problem, Julian said. And you just told an entire board of directors that out loud. Denise Colton had been sitting near the back of the room for the last 20 minutes, silent, her hands wrapped around a paper cup of water she had not touched. She had been called in an hour earlier, informed she would be part of an internal review, and had spent the drive from the airport rehearsing a version of events where she was simply following instructions. A woman caught between a demanding passenger and a superior's directive, doing her job the way she had been trained to do it. Sitting in that conference room, listening to Diane Ashcroft read 11 case files out loud, one after another, she felt that rehearsed version of events come apart in her hands. Miss Colton, Diane said, turning to her, do you want to add anything to the record? Denise set the cup down. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she pressed them flat against her thighs to still them. I knew it wasn't right, she said quietly. When I was standing there, I knew there was no seating conflict. I looked at his boarding pass, and I knew. Her voice caught. I did it anyway, because Preston had already made the call, and I didn't want to be the one who said no to him in front of a passenger. You had a choice, Julian said. Not cruelly, just true. I know, Denise said. Tears had started, and she did not wipe them away. I've known it every single hour since it happened. The room sat with that for a moment, the kind of silence that has weight, rather than emptiness in it. You should call someone, Julian said finally. Denise looked up. What? Someone who knows you, beyond this room, beyond today. She looked down at her hands. My daughter's away at college. She's going to see this online before I even get a chance to call her. Julian's expression softened, just slightly, the first real give in his composure since he had walked into the building that morning. Then call her before the internet tells her who you are, he said. Tell her the truth yourself. Denise nodded, and something in her seemed to steady, even as the tears kept coming. Harold Weiss's phone buzzed against the table. He glanced at it, then looked up at the room. The board is convening an emergency session in 1 hour, he said. Diane closed her folder. Good. Ironwood will attend as an interested party, Monica Reyes said, speaking for the first time. Weiss looked at Julian. Will you still be there? Yes, Julian said, standing, buttoning his jacket. Something flickered across Weiss's face, something close to relief, and Julian let it live there for exactly 1 second before he ended it. Not to finalize the financing, he said. to decide whether Meridian Skyways is worth saving at all. The room went quiet again, differently this time. "Then why come?" Weiss asked. Julian picked up his bag. "Because the version of this company that exists inside that 11-case folder isn't the version I signed a term sheet with. I'd like to find out, in the next hour, which version is actually true." Nobody followed him to the window as he walked to it. Below, on the tarmac, Flight 2140 had finally pushed back from the gate, 2 hours and 11 minutes behind schedule. Seat 2A sat empty. Gerald Whitmore had been quietly moved to a different row after airport operations staff, watching the video circulate in real time on their own phones, decided that keeping him anywhere near a camera lens was a liability nobody wanted to own. Julian had refused to reboard. From that distance, the empty seat looked like nothing at all. But everyone who had been in that boardroom in the last hour understood exactly what it represented now. Not luxury, not status, a test. And Meridian Skyways had failed it in front of the entire country. By 5 o'clock that afternoon, the 14th floor boardroom no longer looked like a room built for control. Coffee cups sat untouched and cold. Legal pads were covered in half-finished notes crossed out and rewritten. Phones buzzed constantly, a low electronic murmur that nobody had the composure left to silence. Outside the glass walls, assistants moved quickly and spoke in the careful, hushed tones people use when they can feel, physically, that a company's future is bending under its own weight. Julian Marsh sat at the table now, not at its head, but halfway down, where he could watch every face in the room without having to turn his neck. Harold Weiss stood near the wall screen, reading a draft public statement out loud one final time, his voice rough from 3 straight hours of calls. Meridian Skyways confirms that a passenger holding a valid, confirmed first-class ticket was wrongfully removed from his assigned seat. "Aboard Flight 2140 this morning," Weiss read. "We have suspended the operations executive involved, pending an independent investigation. We are preserving all internal records related to this incident and protecting any employee who comes forward with additional information. We are also opening a broader review into whether this incident reflects a pattern that has existed within this company for longer than one flight." He stopped reading. Nobody corrected a word of it. A board member joining from Atlanta, a former airline executive named Frank Delacroix, leaned back in his chair and rubbed both hands slowly down his face. A younger board member sitting near the window, a woman named Renata Silva, who had joined Meridian's board only 14 months earlier, kept her eyes fixed on Julian the entire time the statement was read, not with pity, but with something that looked closer to recognition. "It's the most honest statement this company has issued in years," Diane Ashcroft said quietly. "That's not exactly a compliment," Weiss said. "No," Diane said. "It's a diagnosis." The board meeting itself convened at 5:30. Some directors sat around the table in person. Others appeared on screens, beamed in from Dallas, Phoenix, and New York. Each face carrying, at first, the practiced blankness of people preparing for damage control rather than accountability. Then James Kowalski, Meridian's outside counsel, played the footage. All of it. The cabin video from 6 different passengers' phones. The jet bridge audio recovered from a nearby gate camera. Preston Vance's own voice, captured on a 4th angle, saying then, "I'll need to call for assistance," in a tone that made 3 directors physically flinch when they heard it played back. And finally, Denise Colton's shaking confession from the earlier meeting, recorded on Diane's laptop with everyone's knowledge. The room changed with each clip. Frank Delacroix took off his glasses and set them on the table, staring at nothing. A director in New York covered her mouth with one hand and did not move it for almost a full minute. When the last clip ended, Weiss spoke into the silence. "We need to decide, right now, whether this company wants to defend what happened this morning or actually change whatever allowed it to happen in the first place." Nobody answered right away. Renata Silva spoke first. "My father stopped flying for almost 10 years, she said, after he was removed from a business-class seat he had paid for, back in the 90s. He never sued. He never made a scene. He just quietly stopped going anywhere that required him to feel unsafe in his own skin." Her voice stayed steady, but her eyes had gone bright. That was not a customer service failure. That was a wound. And this company has been treating wounds like this as line items in a complaint log for years, because nobody with enough power in this room ever had to feel what it felt like. The silence that followed had a different weight to it than any silence that had come before. Diane Ashcroft moved the first formal motion. Preston Vance would remain suspended, pending termination and a full referral to an independent civil rights review, given the pattern uncovered in the complaint files. An outside firm would investigate every premium cabin removal, reassignment, and passenger complaint filed over the last 5 years. A permanent board ethics committee would be formed. Employee protections for staff who reported discriminatory conduct would be written directly into company policy, not as a poster in a break room, but as an enforceable standard with real consequences attached. The motion passed unanimously, 11 votes to 0. Weiss looked across the table at Julian when the vote closed. "It's a beginning," he said. "Only if you treat it like one," Julian said. Preston Vance was formally terminated 8 days later, following the conclusion of the independent review, which confirmed what Diane Ashcroft's folder had already suggested: a pattern of racially disparate treatment in premium cabin reassigns, stretching back at least 6 years, with Vance's approval attached to every single case. He was referred to the Department of Transportation's Civil Rights Division for further investigation. He did not, in his final exit interview, ever use the word sorry. He told the Human Resources Director, conducting the interview, that he had, in his words, always tried to keep the airline running smoothly for everyone, and that he believed history would eventually see his decisions differently. Nobody in the room believed him, least of all, in some quiet corner of himself he was not yet ready to visit, Preston Vance. Gerald Whitmore's downfall took a different shape, slower, but no less complete. The video of him standing in the aisle, insisting he always sat in that row, sat online for months, clipped and reclipped, played on morning news segments, dissected on business podcasts as a case study in the specific arrogance of men who have never once had to justify why they deserved something. Whitmore Development Group's board, under mounting pressure from 3 separate institutional investors who did not want their names anywhere near the footage, quietly asked him to step down as chairman 4 months later. He did not go quietly. He gave one final press statement, insisting he had done nothing wrong, that he had simply asked for the seat he always sat in, and that this was, in his words, a media pile-on. The statement made things worse, not better, because by then, the public had already watched enough of Preston Vance's unapologetic exit interview clips, leaked from inside the company, to recognize the exact same posture in Whitmore's own words. 2 of his largest development partners pulled out of a joint mixed-use project in Raleigh within the month. He kept his money. He lost almost everything else that had made that money mean anything to him socially, and 18 months later, in a business magazine profile nobody at Meridian Skyways ever saw, he would finally, quietly, admit that he had never once, in 64 years, had to think about whether a seat belonged to him before he sat in it, and that the day he was forced to think about it had cost him more than he had ever imagined losing. Denise Colton was suspended without pay for 6 weeks pending review. She was not terminated. The investigation found that while her conduct that morning had been wrong, she had, unlike Vance, told the truth the moment she was asked to, had shown genuine remorse rather than defensiveness, and had, in the weeks that followed, voluntarily enrolled in and completed a bias and de-escalation training program. that Meridian's new ethics committee had commissioned as part of its broader reforms. She called her daughter that same night, the night of the boardroom meeting. The call lasted 4 minutes. It did not fix anything, but when she hung up, something in her face had changed, still ashamed, but no longer hiding from it. Her daughter had asked her only one question. Did you tell the truth before you were forced to? Denise had not been able to answer that question the way she wanted to. She spent the following months trying to make sure that if it was ever asked of her again, she could. Grace Sullivan, the young flight attendant, who had stood frozen with a coffee pot in her hand that morning, gave a full statement to the independent investigators 3 days after the incident, describing exactly what she had witnessed and exactly why she had felt unable to speak up in the moment. Her statement became one of the pieces of evidence that helped establish the pattern in Vance's file. 6 months later, she was promoted into Meridian Skyways' newly created Passenger Dignity Training Division, where she now spends her days teaching new hires the exact opposite of what she had once been taught on her second day of the job. She keeps a printed still frame from the cabin video pinned above her desk, not of Vance, not of Whitmore, but of the moment Julian Marsh held up his boarding pass. She says it reminds her what the job is actually supposed to protect. 6 months after that morning at Ashcombe International Airport, Julian Marsh sat in seat 2A of Meridian Skyways Flight 214 once again, the same route, the same aircraft type, an anniversary he had not planned but noticed anyway when the confirmation email landed in his inbox. The airline had by then fully implemented its new dignity standards, cabin crew retrained, complaint escalation procedures rebuilt from the ground up, with an outside auditor reviewing every case quarterly, and a framed print of Renata Silva's words to the board hung in the crew lounge of every hub airport in the network. That was not a customer service issue. That was a wound. The financing had gone through in full, all $150 million, released in stages tied to measurable progress on the reforms, a structure Julian's team had insisted on and Meridian's new leadership had not argued with. He wore, that morning as he always did, before something that mattered, a pair of tarnished silver cufflinks that had belonged to his father. Thomas Marsh had worked the ramp at this same airline for 19 years, loading bags in the North Carolina heat, and in 1978 had been turned away at the door of an employee lounge reserved, unofficially but very clearly, for staff who looked a certain way. He had never once been allowed inside that room in 19 years of service. He had died 4 years before Ironwood Capital wired its first dollar into Meridian Skyways' account, never knowing his son would someday hold the fate of that very airline in the palm of his hand. Julian did not tell anyone on the flight who he was. He did not need to anymore. An elderly black passenger 3 rows back, boarding late, was greeted by name, offered help with her overhead bag without being asked twice, and settled into her seat with the kind of quiet, unremarkable ease that most passengers never think twice about, because for most passengers, it had never been in question. Julian watched it happen out of the corner of his eye and said nothing. He did not need the moment to be about him. He only needed it to be ordinary. Before takeoff, he reached into his jacket pocket and touched the cufflinks once, the way he always did, and thought of the words his father used to say at that same stove on Statesville Avenue. Words that had followed him from a rented kitchen to a windowless office to a boardroom on the 14th floor of a company that now, finally, bore some resemblance to the one he had agreed to save. Standing tall was never about never being hurt. It was about refusing to let the hurt teach you to bow. Somewhere over the North Carolina hills, the plane leveled off, and Julian Marsh opened his laptop and got back to work in the seat he had paid for, in a company that had finally learned, at a cost of $150 million, and one very public reckoning, that dignity was never a luxury upgrade to begin with. If this story stayed with you, not because of how it ended, but because you recognized someone inside it, take a second and like it so it can reach someone who needs to hear it today. Share it if you know someone who has ever been made to feel like they had to prove they belonged somewhere they had already earned. And down in the comments, tell me this. Have you ever stood in that cabin, in that boardroom, in that exact kind of room? And if you have, which person were you? I read every single one.